So it will be Peter Monmouth who will be leading it, but there will be a senior legal figure who will be appointed, and the Permanent Secretary will announce that in due course. And on the matter of the 114 files that have not been found, I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that it was in a parliamentary answer, PQ answer last October, that figure was first given, and of course it was repeated in the letter that Mark Sedgwill gave to the Right Honourable Gentleman, a very full response that the Right Honourable Gentleman gave. The investigator found, obviously, was not able to say what had happened to those files. That's precisely, if you like, one of the problems. There is no evidence as to how those files were destroyed, whether they were destroyed or whether they have been mislaid. But obviously the new review is going to be able to go back over the work that investigator did to see whether there is any further evidence that can be adduced in relation to those files.
Sir Edward Garnier.
Having sadly had to deal with quite a number of historic child sex abuse cases in my time as a law officer, may I assure her that the victims of these hideous crimes suffer from them well into their adulthood and often into middle and old age. So the need to bring to justice those who have committed these terrible crimes is surely uncontroversial. But will she make sure that those who have evidence to give or allegations to make do so in the most convenient form possible? That's to say, to one central police force which masterminds the national investigation, rather than having to have a whole host of police forces collecting this information and bringing it into the Crown Prosecution Service. Because what seems to be happening at the moment is that there is a drip feed of insinuation which is causing a lot of distress to innocent people. And what we need to see is the guilty prosecuted and brought to justice, rather than the innocent having their reputations trashed.
I take very seriously the point that my right honourable friend has made. I would just say to him that, of course, we are dealing, in a sense, with two types of allegations. There are the allegations that are made in relation to the sort of, or may be made in relation to the sort of cases which relate to the information that was given to the Home Office in the 1980s. There are also, of course, allegations that are coming forward in relation to activities at particularly at particular children's homes in different parts of the country. And I will reflect on the comment that he has made about the appropriate nature of how those allegations can come forward and the proper investigation of these allegations. But I also echo the point that he made. I think we have all seen through interviews that have been given by those people who are now perhaps sometimes well into their middle age or later, who have been abused as children. This is not a matter that goes away. It is not something that can be forgotten. It lasts with people for the rest of their lives, and we owe it to them to give them truth and justice.
Mr. Simon Densham.
I welcome the Home Secretary's statement. Survivors of child sex abuse are very brave in dealing with the horrific attacks that they have to endure. How will the proposed inquiry engage and thoroughly involve the victims of child sex abuse?
That is a matter that I think is most appropriate for the chairman and the panel themselves to decide, rather than government trying to tell them what to do. I'm sure there will be, once the name of the chairman is announced, I'm sure there will be members of this House who have experience of dealing with these matters, who may wish to make their views known. But I think it is best to leave that for the chairman and panel to identify how they wish to work and how they wish to take evidence and comments from people. But can I also commend the honourable gentleman, obviously, is another member of this House who has done a great deal of work on this matter in trying to uncover the truth about those who've been the victims.
Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome my right honourable friend's announcement of the overarching inquiry, which is important because if we wish to empower children to resist and report child sex abuse, we need to demonstrate that as adults we're prepared to talk openly about these things. Can she also give her view whether it is correct that no government record should be destroyed without a record of that document being kept, that is, that it has been destroyed, that it has not happened in this 114 cases? Is she confident that this isn't still happening? And is she satisfied that this code of conduct, which I think the Right Honourable Gentleman to Blackburn was referring to, the Lord Chancellor's Code of Practice on the Management of Records, is actually being complied with, or indeed is adequate for the purpose?
As I indicated in response to the Right Honourable Member for Blackburn earlier, I think the question of record keeping may very well be something that the panel will be looking at. It is right, there are certain processes in place, as I also indicated in my earlier response. I think one of the issues we're dealing with here is that over the years, over the time period that we're looking at, there were a number of different approaches taken by government departments in relation to record keeping. It is, I think, best practice that it should be identified what has happened to particular records when they are identified. But the practice has varied over time as to what is done. But I think this is one of the aspects that we will obviously need to consider.
Mr. Elfin-Clwyd.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the announcement of these panels of inquiry. But can I ask the Right Honourable Lady a specific question about a North Wales matter? Some 18 months ago, Mrs. Justice McCurr was appointed to look at the Waterhouse inquiry, specifically to see whether its remit was too narrow and or to look at whether there was evidence of wider sexual abuse. She completed her work in July of last year. Since then, there's been silence. Could the Right Honourable Lady look into this and advise the House as to when these findings will be published?
I'm very happy to do that and to write to the Right Honourable Gentleman about the outcome of my inquiry. I'm aware, obviously, that in relation to certain matters in North Wales, there is also Operation Panel of criminal investigation taking place. It may be that that is affecting these issues, but I will certainly look into that matter.
Nicola Blackwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome the Home Secretary's announcement of this inquiry. For too long, survivors of appalling abuse have been denied the transparency and justice they deserve, and in Oxford we know too well the long-term toll that this can take. But it's for that reason that we must not raise false hopes today. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that in addition to access to government and police papers, transparency from local authorities will be essential to achieving a just and effective inquiry? And can she say how she intends to achieve that?
Well, my honourable friend is also well placed to comment on these matters. She did a considerable amount of work, particularly following the recent cases that have taken place in her constituency in Oxford under the Thames Valley Police in relation to child sexual exploitation and grooming. I think she's right. What I intend is that the terms of reference for the panel inquiry should be drawn quite widely and therefore would not just relate to government central government papers. I will publish those terms of reference in due course when it has been possible to discuss those with the appointed chairman. But she is also right that local authorities, both with their responsibilities directly for child protection, but also with their responsibilities for the placing of children in care of various sorts, will be an important source of information.
Mr. Bill Esterson.
Speaker, whatever investigations and inquiries take place in the coming months and possibly years, will she make sure that support is in place for the victims, including, crucially, the counselling that for many, many years has been far too difficult to access, both for children and for adults? And will she work closely with ministerial colleagues to make sure that, given the way that child abuse is sometimes discussed publicly, that the child protection system and those working in child protection are not undermined in any way by the way that the inquiries are held into historical abuse?
The honourable gentleman raises a question about support for the victims in terms of counselling, which is more appropriate for other government departments to consider, but I will certainly raise that with my colleagues. And in relation to the way that we discuss this issue, he is right. There are many people out there who are working assiduously to protect children and safeguard children, and I in no way wish to undermine the work that they are doing. It is important that we are looking at a number of allegations and cases where people have been prosecuted for historic abuse, but also, of course, we've seen more recent cases of abuse taking place. I mentioned a number in my areas in my statement, and it is important that we learn from those to ensure that we have got the best systems in place to provide the protection for children that we all want.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for a statement. Would my right honourable friend not agree that the situation now has dramatically improved since, say, 2003? The public attitude has improved, the legal changes have improved, and in fact the authorities are now in a position to act proactively when they get the chance and when the information comes forward. But secondly, regarding the inquiry, would she agree that agencies such as the police and social services should have a legal obligation to provide information on the request, but also to act in a positive manner to the inquiry?
Certainly agree with my right honourable friend that I think all agencies, and I would encourage all agencies to act constructively and positively in relation to this inquiry, because that is the way that we can get to the truth. We've seen that in other similar inquiry panels that have taken place. And on the first point, I would also commend my right honourable friend for the work that he has done over many years in looking at the legislative structure and in dealing with these issues and working with the police to ensure that the best possible support is given in relation to the activities of paedophiles. And of course, most recently, we see in the Serious Crime Bill the introduction of the new offence in relation to the possession of paedophile manuals.
Mr. Ronnie Campbell.
The Home Secretary looked at Operation Rose in Northumberland, which took back a few years ago. It's been more apparent that it was a whitewash as more victims are coming forward each time, each day, each month.
Yeah. I'm certainly happy to take the point that the honourable gentleman raises away. I mean, it is precisely because why I really want to ensure that we do cover the ground in terms of covering all these cases that have come up, that the terms of the inquiry panel, I think it's important that those are drawn quite widely. But I will take the point and look into the matter that the honourable gentleman raises.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
The country will welcome the principles in my honourable friend's reviews and panel. Can she, with other departments, make clear to all children, especially looked after children, that if they have worries they can't communicate to the people looking after them, that there is an outside place where they can go with confidence to talk about their worries? And in terms of the point about archives, can I refer her to the letter she's had from Dr. Richard Stone, and I expect to answer this afternoon, about hidden stories of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, where, as a member of the inquiry, he hasn't had access to the papers while trying to implement the recommendations. So it seems to be important to learn the lessons from that as well.
I will obviously look carefully at the letter that my honourable friend refers to in relation to examples from other inquiries that have taken place. I think it is important that young people who are victims of sexual abuse do feel that they are able to go somewhere to report that. What I also think is important, is a point that's been raised by more than one honourable member today, is that the fact that we are talking about this, the fact that we have acknowledged what has happened to young people in the past and the importance of dealing with that, I hope will give people who are victims a greater confidence that if they come forward, they will be listened to and they will be heard. And I would also hope, I mean, we've seen these very recent cases that are being taken forward by police forces. Sadly, I see the lists of the number of operations that are taking place up and down the country, and the number is shocking, frankly, of cases that are being taken forward by police to deal with child sexual exploitation and grooming. And all of those cases that are being taken forward, as people see those being dealt with, hopefully that again will give young people confidence to come forward where they have been victims of this abuse.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
As well as setting on these great and the good independent, so-called independent experts and people that are known to government, wouldn't it be more convincing if the Home Secretary said, and I'm going to do something else, I'm going to make sure that all those cuts in the public sector, in local authorities, people dealing with child abuse every single day are going to get a decent pay rise. That's what this government ought to do, if they really meant it.
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, that this government has a record of being willing to deal with and address issues around child sexual exploitation. I would particularly commend the work that was done as the Minister for Children by my honourable friend, the member for East Worthing and Shoreham, on his programme on the strategy on dealing with child exploitation, which is having an impact. Now, of course, government constantly needs to look to see if we can do more, and that is why it's important we have the panel to look at the lessons learned.
Rob Wilson.
My welcome to the measures the Home Secretary has announced today. I say that they will offer great reassurance to the public. It's important that all public institutions, including Parliament and the NHS, are held to account. So in this respect, will she confirm that the inquiry will have full access to information from quasi-public bodies, such as the BBC, but also institutions where we know significant child abuse has taken place, such as the church?
As I said, the terms of reference will be published in due course. It is my intention that this should be a wide inquiry, and that therefore it should be possible for it to look not just at state institutions but at other bodies where it is the case that we need to look at their appropriate, whether they have appropriately been protecting children or not, as the case may be.
Lisa Nandy.
Mid-1990s, a senior ex-whip who had served in the 1970s told the BBC that the whip's office routinely helped MPs with scandals, including those, in his own words, involving small boys, and that they did it in order to exert control over those individuals and prevent problems for the government. It's just one powerful example of how personal and political interests can conspire to prevent justice from happening. So can we have a full commitment that this inquiry will consider not just the police and social services, but will also look at what happens at the heart of power, and that if those systems are found to exist today, that they will be overturned, whether that makes life uncomfortable for political parties, whether it makes life uncomfortable for Parliament, or whether it makes life uncomfortable for the government itself?
It is not my intention that political parties should be outside the scope of the inquiry. I think this has to be wide-ranging. It has to look at every area where it is possible that people have been guilty of abuse, and we need to learn lessons to ensure that the systems we have in place are able to identify that and deal with it appropriately.
Mr Nigel Evans.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the reviews announced by the Home Secretary today, and we want those reviews to be thorough, but we don't want another shilcot. We don't want it to drag on interminably. So can we be assured that there will be some form of timescale by which they will be expected to report? And as far as the 114 missing files are concerned, they're either destroyed, missing, or not found. That seems to me that somebody believes they may still be there. Will she assure the House that somebody's still looking for those files and that no stone will be left unturned until we know exactly where they are?
In relation to the issue of the timetable, as I indicated, I would expect the inquiry panel work to go beyond the general election. I think it is necessary that it has sufficient time to do its job properly and comprehensively, but I do undertake that a progress update report will be given to Parliament before May 2015. I think the deadline, the sort of final timetable, is something that needs to be discussed with the chairman of the panel, because it will be partly determined by the way that they intend to operate the work of the panel, but also it will also be determined by the progress of the criminal investigations, because we don't want to jeopardise those in any sense. And in relation to the files, the investigator certainly did not find any evidence of that the files were in any shape or form in existence. But I think what I'm saying is that it was not categorical evidence that they had been destroyed, because that hadn't been recorded, and hence the issues that have been raised about the recording of matters relating to records.
Mr Paul Flynn.
Sir Jimmy Savile was the honoured inviting guest at 11 New Year's Eve's parties hosted by a Prime Minister. He was given the keys to 2 hospitals by health ministers. He was a trusted friend of royalty. Can we know whether the intelligence services had surveillance of this man, and if they did put in reports, why was no action taken on them?
I've in response to an earlier question, I have addressed the issue of my expectation of the panel being able to have as much access to government papers as possible. In relation to the sort of wider issue that the honourable gentleman raises, I think this is precisely why we need to look back at these cases, is to ask the question why it was that somebody who was serially abusing a large number of people, of children and others and adults, over a period of time, was able to do so and continue to be fated by society at large.
Mr. Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary, I think, was right to be cautious about an overarching inquiry. And is she now convinced that an inquiry that looks over multiple decades, multiple institutions in the public sector and outside, covering this issue, will be sufficiently focused and will therefore be effectual? Because the last thing we want is to have this inquiry failing to help draw a line on those for those who've suffered such horrors in their early years.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and there is often a tension in these matters between ensuring that a report or an inquiry can look as widely as is necessary in order to be able to get to the truth, while at the same time ensuring that it is not going to continue for so long that it ceases to lose its relevance, in some sense, when it reports. That, of course, will be a matter that I will be discussing with the chairman of the inquiry to ensure that it can be conducted in a manner that the lessons can be learnt sufficiently swiftly for action to be put in place to protect people, ensure that we're protecting children today.
Mr. Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I, on behalf of this bench, welcome this inquiry and other investigations that's been mentioned by the Home Secretary, but can she assure me that, where possible, she'll keep the devolved administrations informed about the progress of these inquests and work with them to ensure that we do really get to the heart of the matter?
I'm happy to give the honourable gentleman the assurance that we will talk to the devolved administrations and work with them on the work that is being done by this inquiry. And obviously some of the matters this will be covering England and Wales, and matters are many of the matters are of a devolved nature, and therefore I think it is important that particularly important that we work with the devolved administrations.
Michael Ellis.
I read the executive summary of the 2013 review where 114 files are said to have been lost or destroyed, but the investigator says that he only looked at something called the Central Home Office database. What about files that might be held by the Security Service or other agencies? Will the Home Secretary confirm that files held by such bodies and on other databases will be incorporated in the review about which she's spoken today?
I certainly think it is important that in the work that is being done, that other databases can be interrogated and can be looked into, as I have indicated in response to an earlier question from the Honourable Member for West Bromwich East. There are issues obviously around certain matters that relate to secret and intelligence material and access to that, but there are, I am sure, ways in which we can ensure that all appropriate material is going to be looked into, whether that is appropriate for the review or for the inquiry panel.
And Coffey.
Mr. Speaker, in the 1970s and 80s there was a confusion between sexual liberation and sexual exploitation, and that gave cover for the abuse of some children to escape challenge. Much progress has been made, but victims of child abuse are still being blamed for their own exploitation. Would she agree, as well as understanding historical attitudes, the independent inquiry panel need to look at current attitudes if we are to make significant progress in protecting our children?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady makes a very important point about the atmosphere, the attitudes that actually against which these abuses took place. And we do need to be very clear about what is abuse today. And it is why, for example, in a related context, the Home Office has been running a campaign for teenagers on This Is Abuse to help them to identify when abuse is taking place. For some of them, sadly, they may have seen relationships which are abusive and therefore portrayed to them as normal. And we need to ensure that everybody understands what abuse is and also understands their ability to say no.
Mark Reckless.
The Home Secretary mentioned political parties. On alleged child abuse by past or present members of Parliament, will she confirm whether the inquiry will consider any allegations or evidence held by the whips.
The intention of the inquiry panel is to be able to look as widely as possible at these issues. I should perhaps clarify a point. The inquiry panel will not be conducting investigations into a specific allegation, insofar as those would be matters properly for criminal investigations to take place. It is looking across the board at the way things have been approached in the past and asking that question as to whether, and I intend to draw this, as I said, would expect to draw this quite widely, people did have in place the proper protections for children or not, and if not, what are the gaps? Are those gaps still existing today? And do we need to be able to look into those, what do we need to do to make sure that those gaps are filled? But as I've said, I would expect that as much information as possible is given to the panel to enable them to do that.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the course of doing constituency casework, every member of this House will come across vulnerable adults and children. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that members of Parliament and caseworkers should undergo CRB checks? We've legislated for this for everybody else in similar positions of responsibility. Isn't it time that we did so in this House too?
Well, I have to say to the Honourable Lady that this is, I mean, in a sense, there is a paradox there in that a Member of Parliament can go into a school, can be in a school and things like this without that CRB check. But I think this is precisely the sort of matters in terms of how do we protect children. The inquiry panel will look at how do we protect children. Are there gaps today in any area? Do we need to fill those gaps? And what I would expect coming out of the inquiry panel report is something that will identify areas where they feel it is necessary to potentially legislate further in order to protect children.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend for uniquely, it seems, understanding the gravity of these never-ending revelations and the need for transparency and urgency investigating them, and gently regretting the rather partisan approach taken by the Shadow Home Secretary, in contrast to the all-party spirit of the 141 honourable members of this House who called for this inquiry. Can I just ask her, will the panel have the power to summon evidence and subpoena witnesses? Will it be able to go where it needs to go? And crucially, will it be able to trigger criminal investigations against anyone found responsible for covering these acts up and not just the perpetrators?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and can I also commend him for the work that he has done over many years, not just as Minister for Children, but I know in our times in opposition how assiduous he was in his desire to ensure that children are properly protected and that these issues of abuse and exploitation of children and the lack of safety of children are properly taken into account and properly dealt with. The intention is, I would expect the panel, if they found allegations which they believed were more appropriate for the police to investigate under a criminal investigation, for those allegations to be passed to the police for criminal investigation. The panel will be able to call witnesses. They will not have, in the initial structure that they're being set up with, they would not have the ability to require witnesses to come before them, and they will have to consider whether calling a witness would in any way jeopardise or prejudice a criminal investigation that is taking place if that individual was involved in that criminal investigation. As I've said, if it is the case that the chairman finds that it is necessary, that the chairman decides to recommend that the inquiry panel should be turned into a full statutory inquiry under the Inquiries Act, which would of course have the right to require witnesses to come forward, then as I've said, we will be absolutely clear we will go down that route.
And Fluid.
Mr. Speaker, in the early 1990s, I interviewed 7 young men in my constituency, all of whom had been victims of child abuse at Bryn Estyn in North Wales. None of them asked for compensation, but all of them said, we want somebody to say sorry. And that was uppermost in their minds. They wanted somebody to admit what they did was wrong. Secondly, I had to bring parliamentary business, Mr. Speaker, to a halt 2 nights running on the floor of this House in order to get the main allegations contained in the then secret Gillings report into the public eye. Because shortly afterwards a public inquiry was set up and all talk of that was shut down for 3 years. I've given evidence to, I think it's Operation Pallial, one of the inquiries going on, and I just wondered if she got any time frame for when they might report, because in my view this has dragged on for far too long.
The Honourable Lady raises an important point in relation to time frames. I'm not able to give her a time frame for Operation Pallial at the moment in terms of its termination. It is obviously ongoing and dealing with individuals and matters as they come across them and are able to deal with them. But I will, if I may, write to her on what they've been doing and how long they think it might take before they are able to deal with that.
Speaker, the police are becoming increasingly successful at breaking up human trafficking rings. Adult victims of human trafficking are looked after in safe homes run centrally under the responsibility of the Justice Department. Unfortunately, children are given to local authorities to be looked after, and there is evidence that they are often re-trafficked and abused again. Would the Home Secretary look at installing a system similar that we have for adults for children?
The purpose of the child advocate trials that we are putting in place is precisely to find out how best we can ensure that the child victims of human trafficking are supported and given the support and help that they need. It is the case, as my honourable friend has said, and he recognises this with his the work that he